So we got this piece sent to us called "Corrupt Policies of the International Christian Church," Part 2.
Part 2.
Yeah, it's by Daniel Berg.
Interesting.
And we wanted to take a deep dive into it. It really goes into some detail about financial practices within the ICC.
Yeah, I mean, financial stuff can be really fascinating, right?
Oh, yeah, especially when you start looking at the psychology behind it. And that's one of the things that stood out to me about this piece.
Right.
Berg's perspective is informed not just by his experience in the ICC, but also by his background in engineering and his interest in psychology, particularly group psychology.
Okay. So he's coming at this from a kind of a unique angle.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like he's looking at these policies not just in terms of their financial implications, but also in how they might impact individuals on a psychological level within the group dynamic of the church.
Interesting. So what's the big takeaway? What's his main argument here?
Well, he doesn't mince words. He comes right out and says that the financial policies of the ICC are, in his words, corrupt, and that there's a deliberate use of psychological manipulation to frame these policies as matters of spiritual commitment.
Okay, so he's not pulling any punches.
Hmm.
So where does he start? What kind of policies is he talking about?
So he starts with something that seems pretty common in a lot of churches: contribution cards, which later became known as pledge cards.
Right.
You know, those cards you fill out to indicate how much you plan to give to the church. Initially, they were presented as a tool for members to plan their giving.
Tool budgeting, right.
Exactly. Be thoughtful about your contributions. But Berg argues that this initial intention took a turn.
Okay, how so?
He describes increasing pressure on members to raise the amount they pledged on these cards.
Huh. Like not just encouragement, but actual pressure.
Yeah, like it wasn't just a gentle suggestion, you know. There was a real social dynamic at play. He talks about how members were often asked to show both their previous and their updated contribution amounts.
Oh, in front of others.
Yeah, it creates a public record of whether someone has increased their giving or not. And that kind of social visibility can be really influential, right?
Yeah, for sure. Like you don't want to be the only one who hasn't upped their pledge, right?
Right. And then Berg points out a pivotal moment: the introduction of a Bible verse, Ecclesiastes 5.4-6, printed on the pledge cards themselves.
Okay, that's the one about fulfilling vows to God.
Exactly. And following this, a sermon was delivered basically declaring that whatever amount members wrote on these pledge cards, it was now considered a vow to God.
So it went from a financial planning tool to a solemn vow. That's a pretty significant shift.
Huge shift. And Berg says he was, pretty surprised by this change, and he observed similar reactions from others in the congregation. It makes you question whether people were truly aware that by filling out this card, they were making what was now being presented as a binding spiritual vow.
Yeah, were they really given all the information up front?
Right. And it seems like the leadership really doubled down on this vow framing. Berg mentions how they started referencing numbers 30.2 more and more, which also talks about the binding nature of vows.
So they're reinforcing this idea that these pledges are serious spiritual commitment.
Absolutely. And when Berg actually asked about this shift in interpretation, he says the response he got was, "Didn't you see the Bible verse on the pledge cards?"
Wow, that seems kind of dismissive.
Very dismissive. And this is where Berg's argument about deceit really takes shape. He's saying that the initial presentation of the cards as a financial planning tool was just a front.
The guys.
Yeah. And that the leadership basically retroactively declared them as vows to God without ever being clear about their intentions from the start.
It's like they pulled a bait and switch.
Yeah, and Berg even poses this thought experiment. What if they had been upfront? What if they had said, "Hey, everyone, these cards represent a vow to God. If you don't fulfill it, you're breaking a vow, potentially even sinning."
Yeah, I mean, how many people would have filled those cards out if that's how it was presented from the get-go?
Exactly. Berg's point is that by not being transparent, they prevented people from really thinking through the financial and spiritual implications of what they were signing up for.
And from considering whether these so-called convictions about giving were really aligned with their own understanding of Scripture.
Right. And speaking of Scripture, Berg points out something pretty interesting. He brings up the verses in Ecclesiastes 5 and Deuteronomy 23, the very verses the church was using.
The one's about vows, right?
Yeah. But he points out that those verses actually caution against making rash vows. They say it's better not to vow at all than to make a vow and not fulfill it.
So it's almost like they were cherry-picking Scripture to support their agenda.
That's exactly his point. And he also talks about how anyone who dared to raise these concerns, to question any of this, they were quickly labeled as bitter.
Oh, so that's how they shut down dissent.
Yeah. He also describes a kind of conditioning that went on, where those who reduced their pledged contributions, they were publicly shamed, while those who maintained or even increased their giving, even if they were struggling financially, they were praised and held up as examples.
So there's a social pressure, right? Like you're rewarded for conforming and punished for speaking up or, making responsible financial decisions.
That's right. And Berg's conclusion on this whole pledge card issue is pretty damning. He believes this policy was intentionally designed to maximize the flow of finances to the leadership, possibly at the expense of the congregation's well-being.
It's like they were prioritizing their own financial gain over the needs of their members.
That's how Berg sees it. And he argues that this policy also discouraged people from adjusting their contributions based on their actual income, even if it was the responsible thing to do.
Wow. So that's the pledge card issue. What else does he talk about?
So then he moves on to what he calls steadily increasing involuntary special contributions.
Okay, note of those.
These were like annual appeals for specific causes, usually supporting mission teams or something. And Berg says they were presented as special, above and beyond the regular giving.
Right, but he calls them involuntary. So what's the story there?
Well, he provides a really detailed timeline of how these special contributions evolved over several years, and it's a pretty eye-opening progression.
Okay, well, lay it out for me.
So it starts in June 2008. They announced this special contribution equal to 10 times the regular weekly giving.
10 times. That's already quite a bit.
Yeah, and it just goes up from there. He points out that between 2008 and 2010, the general policy for weekly contributions also increased.
So they're raising the baseline giving and adding these special contributions on top of that.
Right. And then the special contributions really start to escalate. In 2011, they asked for 15 times the weekly contribution. And then later that year, another 4 times the weekly contribution.
So it's like they're constantly asking for more and more money.
Yeah, and it gets even more concerning in 2013. They implemented a policy of warning and potential disfellowshipping for members who miss even 2 weeks of their regular contributions.
Whoa. Disfellowshipping.
Yeah.
Just from missing 2 weeks.
Yeah, regardless of the reason. So basically, regular giving is no longer a voluntary expression of faith. It's a mandatory obligation.
That changes the whole dynamic, right?
Absolutely. And the special contributions don't stop there. In May 2013, they asked for a 20x contribution.
20 times?
Yeah. And they present it as a combination of a previously requested 15x and a new 5x contribution. But then later they asked for another 3x contribution.
So it's like they're playing games with the numbers, trying to make it seem like it's not as much as it really is.
Berg calls it a technicality loophole. And he says this pattern continues into 2014 and 2015, 20x, then 6x, then 25x.
It's just this constant upward trajectory of giving.
Yeah, and Berg even says he predicted further increases, which he says were eventually confirmed.
So he saw the writing on the wall.
He did. And he also points out the language they used. They would often refer to the assigned special contribution amount as a goal, as if it were something the individual members had come up with themselves.
Like a personal aspiration.
Yeah. But Berg challenges this framing, He says his understanding was that his initial commitment was to a 10x contribution, not a 25x goal. And then there's the whole everybody's doing it thing, the peer pressure.
Yeah, that unspoken pressure to conform.
Right. And that leads us to how they tried to justify all of this. They would often reference examples from the early church, like the collection for famine relief in Acts and the giving for the temple in Chronicles.
Sure, those are examples of generosity in the Bible.
But Berg emphasizes that those examples were characterized by willingness and joyful giving. And he contrasts that with the ICC, where he experienced criticism, shame, even character assassination for those who couldn't meet the full demand.
So it wasn't about giving freely and cheerfully. It was about meeting a quota.
Right. And any shortfall was often treated like a debt owed to the church, not a freely given offering.
That doesn't sound very biblical.
Berg even mentions that similar tactics were used in the ICOC under Kip McKeon, so this isn't a new thing.
So there's a pattern of this kind of behavior.
Yeah. And he also talks about a lack of genuine gratitude from the leadership, almost a sense of entitlement, like the congregation owed them this money. And he mentions the pressure on Bible Talk leaders to make sure everyone in their group met their assigned contribution.
That's putting a lot of pressure on the leaders, too.
Right. And then Berg talks about how he was told that members needed to both obey by giving the requested amount and give willingly and cheerfully.
Wait, so they're supposed to feel pressured and give freely at the same time?
Yeah.
How does that even work?
Yeah, it's a contradiction.
Yeah.
And then there's the constant references to Acts 4.3237, the passage about the early disciples selling all their possessions and sharing everything.
Right. That's a powerful image of communal living and generosity.
But Berg argues that they were twisting the meaning of that passage. In Acts, the sharing was about meeting the needs of the community, caring for the poor and new converts. And he points out that the ICC itself doesn't seem to have any kind of similar benevolent special contributions to help its own members who are struggling.
So the money's not going to the people who need it most.
That's his point. He also says that new converts are shown these high contribution levels as evidence of devotion without being told how those expectations came about.
So they're being manipulated into thinking this is normal.
Right. And then we get to what Berg calls tagging, which is basically street begging. He says this was introduced as a way for members who couldn't afford the special contributions to raise the money.
So they're being asked to give money they don't have, and then they're being told to go beg for it.
That's essentially what's happening. And Berg points out that this tagging often took place without the necessary permits or licenses, so it was essentially illegal.
They were breaking the law.
Yeah. He says they were aware that people were calling it begging, but they preferred the term tagging. And when people got in trouble with the law, they were just told to move to different cities and keep doing it.
Wow, so they're encouraging illegal activity and putting their members at risk.
That's how Berg sees it. And he contrasts this with the Bible's clear teaching about obeying governing authorities. He says he raised concerns about the legality of this, but they were ignored.
It's getting pretty heavy.
It is, and Berg kind of wraps it all up by saying that while nobody's perfect, he became increasingly uncomfortable and fearful of what he saw as a pattern of disobedience to Scripture for financial gain.
He's saying it's not just about making mistakes, it's about a deliberate pattern of behavior.
Right. And he worries that the ICC is losing its distinction from other churches that might disregard Scripture for popular beliefs. He sees a selective use of Scripture, focusing on the parts that support giving money, but ignoring the parts that challenge that.
So they're creating their own version of Christianity, essentially.
That's how he sees it. And he even brings in the work of Gustave Le Bon, a psychologist who studied group dynamics. He talks about how groups can lose their ability to reason, become intolerant of dissent, and develop a sense of invincibility.
So he's saying that the ICC leadership was operating like a closed-off group, resistant to any criticism.
Yeah. And he ultimately defines corruption as being motivated by money. And he sees a consistent pattern of decisions in the ICC that benefit the leadership financially. He summarizes the key practices: the pressure to increase giving, the pledge cards becoming vows, the constant demands for special contributions.
It's all about the money.
He believes so. And he points out the language they use, called convictions, goals. He thinks these words are used to manipulate people, to make them feel obligated to give.
So it's not just about the policies themselves, it's about the way they're presented.
Right. And he ends by saying that his assessment is based on observation and evidence, not bitterness. He even says he's open to being proven wrong if someone can provide evidence to the contrary.
So he's not just trying to bash the church. He's genuinely concerned about what he's witnessed.
Yeah. And he says what he really wants is genuine spiritual growth and healthy relationships, not exploitation that leads to disillusionment. Oh, and he mentions that he's going to write more about extortion and character assassination in future articles.
Oh, wow. So there's more to come.
Yeah, this is just the tip of the iceberg.
Well, this has certainly been a deep dive. It's incredible how Berg uses his background in engineering and psychology to analyze what's happening in the ICC.
Yeah, it really makes you think about how group dynamics and psychological manipulation can play out in all sorts of contexts, not just in churches.
Absolutely. It makes you wonder, how do we protect ourselves from that kind of influence? How do we make sure we're thinking critically and not just blindly following?
Right. And for anyone involved in a church or any organization that relies on financial contributions, it raises questions about transparency and accountability. How do we make sure those contributions are truly voluntary and given with a cheerful heart, not out of pressure or fear?
Big question.
Big questions. And we encourage you to check out Berg's work for yourself and really wrestle with these issues. It's a challenging read, but it's an important one.
For sure.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive, and we'll be back soon with more explorations into the things that matter.
See ya.